Well, welcome to this short reading from 2 Samuel chapter 2, beginning at verse 8 through to verse 11. As it comes up, we're starting to reflect on one of the saddest parts of Israelite history. You may have thought the war between Saul and David was a sad part, but effectually there was no war. The war actually occurred with the house of David and the house of Saul. And there must be no sadder time than civil war. That is a war between brother and sister, a war between father and son, a war between neighbouring towns, those who are supposed to be united. And one of the great things about being in this nation of Australia is that we haven't had a civil war. We've had wars, of course, wars that have been fought offshore, wars that even fought onshore between the indigenous population of Australia and the colonial countries as they came in. But in terms of a civil war, we've been blessed by not having that. That is quite unusual in the history of humanity. And here we have one of the saddest cases in all of Israelite history, a civil war brewing between the tribes of Israel.
2 Samuel 2, beginning at verse 8. Meanwhile, Abner, son of Ner, the commander of Saul's army, had taken Ishbosheth, son of Saul, and brought him over to Mahanaim. He made him king over Gilead, Ashuri, and Jezreel, and also over Ephraim, Benjamin, and all Israel. Ishbosheth, son of Saul, was 40 years old when he became king over Israel, and he reigned 2 years. The tribe of Judah, however, remained loyal to David. The length of time David was king in Hebron over Judah was 7 years and 6 months.
As you can see there, the sad reality is that most civil wars can often be boiled down to wars between families, wars between opposing men who just did not like each other or who are fighting for power. It's one of those sad realities that you see even in World War I, where it's almost a war between neighbouring families when you look at the war of Germany, Russia, and the United Kingdom. And the consequence of a family squabble is the death of millions, and in this case, the death of thousands. It says, meanwhile, Abner, son of Ner. Now, Abner is the cousin of Saul. Now, a question that is not asked, but I think we're supposed to wonder about is, how on earth did Abner, who was supposed to be, if you recall, the man next to Saul in all battles, he's the commander of the army, how did he even escape? And what we will discover about Abner is he is one cunning individual. He escapes with the most, if you like, pliable, malleable son of Saul, Ishbosheth. Now, no one's name is ever Ishbosheth. Bosheth basically means you're a shame on the family. And Ish, in this case, is a man, so he's a man of shame. Now, unless Saul had a real sense of humour, I suspect this name has been chosen by our authors to demonstrate the reality of his character. Because he's a man who does not fight, he's a man of no notable intellect, and sadly he's a man easily controlled by Abner, the son of his father, Saul. His name was Eshbaal, and he's a man who is not therefore after God's own heart. Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, brought over to Mahanaim. Now the reason, of course, that he's situated in Mahanaim is because it is in the extremity of the area that is not under Philistine control, and therefore he has a bit of time to sort of gather his forces together. And the other reason that this village is named here is because of its also links, like Hebron, back to the Old Testament. But it's the name that means two camps. It's where the camps were set up as Jacob went back to visit his brother Esau. And if you recall, he didn't trust that Esau was going to look after him after the way that he himself treated his brother. And so as he goes back there, he puts his people in two camps. And that happened here at Mahanaim. And when he does that, he's demonstrating a lack of trust. And that complete lack of trust that he did is foreshadowed here by Abner and Ishbosheth's lack of trust in the people of Israel to choose the right king. Yes, but more than that, the people under God to choose the right king and God to choose the king. God has chosen David to be the king, and they are demonstrating that they're not willing to follow through that. And the reason that that's important is Abner even heard it. He was next to Saul when Saul himself confessed that God had chosen David. But Abner will not listen. He has divided the kingdom, and what is a forerunner for the eventual division of Israel is a sign that those who choose against God, sadly, are choosing civil war, both against the people of Israel and against God. It is not merely a war against your fellow man. It is a war against your fellow god. And that is exactly what the name Baal in this case means, with Eshbaal. Our text continues on with the area. Now the area demonstrates really a small outcropping of east of the Jordan River, as well as on the other side of the Jordan over at Gilead. So basically the Philistines had almost cut Israel in half, but not quite. And so the area that Abner and his troops have got is just this little slither on the eastern side of the Jordan River, and then the other side of the western side of the Jordan River, in order to create this barrier between David and the rest of Israel. Ishbosheth, son of Saul, was 40 years old in verse 10, and when he became king over Israel, and he reigned 2 years. So David here is demonstrating that he will take over in a very short period of time. The tribe of Judah, however, remained loyal to David. The length of time David was king in Hebron over Judah was 7 years and 6 months. So you go, well, what happened for the other 5 years? That seems to be the length of time it took for Ishbosheth and Abner to regain some sort of control over this northern part of Israel. And once they did control this northern part of Israel, maybe against the Philistines, or just sort of gathering up the area that the Philistines hadn't bothered to go and invade because it was a fairly useless part of land for them. They weren't willing to travel that far inland. And so it took roughly nearly 5 years for Abner and Ishbosheth to gather up all this territory and then to set their mind against David. Now the reason that that's important, as you can see here, that the text makes it clear, is that it wasn't a short decision for them to revolt against God. It took them over 4 years, nearly 5 years, to gather up the forces to solidify their position in northern Israel against their fellow countrymen, all because Abner and Ishbosheth did not want to submit themselves to both God and to David's leadership. This was a long-term decision, but once that decision was made, it only took 2 years for it to unravel. This is what the text goes on to say. He was only reigning for 2 years. It took him 4.5 years to get it all organized, but a very short time to unravel it. And the reason is because the blessing of God was never on them. David was the king. David was in the process of becoming their long-term king, but they would not listen, and therefore they stood up against God. The sad reality is those who stand up against God have destructive impact upon this world, and destructive impact, in this case, upon the people of Israel. A civil war started, a civil war continued with death and mayhem, and the result of that, sadly, was the unlikely event that they could win. But sadly, they gave it a go, because they did not want God, they did not want David, and they fought against it, even though it was not likely that they could win. Sandwiched in between David's forces and the Philistines, they stood up against God and lost. And the sad reality is that as they lost, they dragged thousands of people down with them in their neighboring Benjamite area and the tribes of Ephraim and Asher. Sadly, people are dragged down by other people's desire for power and other people's sinfulness. Let it never be so with the people of God. Like David, inquire of God, listen to God, follow his instructions, and if it means that you need to change, like it should have meant for Abner, then change you shall. For railing up against God always has one outcome: defeat. And our defeat may occur slowly or may occur quickly, but defeat it will be. And in the end, we want to be on the side of God in this world and certainly into the next. Amen.